He had just left the hospital, but what he saw in the parking lot froze him in his tracks. A little girl, alone, sitting behind the wheel. Why was she there? And when the truth came out, it shattered his heart. Before we dive into today's emotional story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what's the time there right now? A cold night wrapped itself around the hospital parking lot. The kind of night where silence felt heavier than the rain that drizzled steadily from the sky, leaving the ground glistening under the dim yellow lights. Ethan Cole, the billionaire CEO known for his sharp mind and colder heart, stepped out of the automatic glass doors, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement as he adjusted the lapel of his tailored suit. He had just left the bedside of one of his company's injured workers, but his face showed no trace of warmth, only fatigue, as though even acts of compassion had to fit into his schedule. His expression was carved from stone, his blue eyes reflecting the hard shell he carried through life. A man used to solving problems with contracts, money, and numbers. But as he walked across the lot, something interrupted his well-rehearsed stride. His eyes caught a movement in the corner, a faint shadow against the rain-slicked car windows, and for a brief moment he thought perhaps it was his imagination. But then he froze, his breath faltering, his pulse skipping, not from fear, but from the surreal strangeness of what he saw. Inside the driver's seat of a rusted, broken-down car sat a tiny figure, no older than 6. A child. A girl. Her golden hair clung to her cheeks, dampened by the misty drizzle. Her small hands gripped the steering wheel with such seriousness, as though the fragile wheel was her lifeline, the only thing anchoring her in this vast, empty world. She was shivering, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from the loneliness that wrapped tighter around her than the rain-soaked night. Ethan blinked, his steps slowing, his mind struggling to process the image before him. A billionaire who had faced ruthless boardrooms and courtroom battles suddenly found himself unable to take another step forward, undone by the innocence of a child. Sitting alone in a car that looked as abandoned as she did. The air felt different now, thick with something unexplainable. His hand brushed his forehead as he muttered, almost in disbelief, "What is a child doing here, at this hour?" His voice was low, almost as though he feared that speaking louder would shatter the fragile image before him. The drizzle tapped rhythmically on the car's roof, echoing like a sad lullaby, but the girl didn't move. She clutched the wheel tighter, her tiny knuckles pale, her lips quivering with the effort of holding herself together. Ethan's heart, usually armored against emotions, twisted painfully in his chest, because even from where he stood he could see the look in her eyes, an expression of someone far too young to carry such silence, such weight. The world around him blurred, the neon hospital sign flickering behind him, the rain continuing its endless fall, yet all he could see was her, alone, fragile, shivering. A part of him wanted to turn away, pretend he hadn't seen, bury this moment under layers of wealth and indifference. But another part, a buried part he hadn't felt in years, whispered that fate had placed him here, that this wasn't coincidence, but something that demanded his heart, not his wallet. His chest rose and fell, conflicted, as his eyes stayed locked on hers, and in that suspended moment, time seemed to pause, as though the night itself held its breath, waiting to see what he would do. The camera of fate lingered on her trembling face, her wide blue eyes filled with questions no child should have to ask, her lips pressed together in an attempt to be brave. Who was she? Why was she here, all alone in the middle of the night, sitting behind the wheel of a car that couldn't take her anywhere? Ethan didn't know yet, but he could already feel the answer would change everything. Ethan drew a steady breath, his palm iced shoes splashing softly against the wet asphalt as he closed the distance between himself and the car, every step slow, cautious, as though he were approaching a fragile bird that might fly away at the slightest sound. The rain misted across his shoulders, darkening the fabric of his expensive suit, but for once, he didn't care about appearances. His eyes were fixed on the child inside the car. She noticed him now, her posture stiffening, her small frame straightening as though she were trying to summon a courage that didn't belong to someone her age. Her lips curved into a weak smile, one that trembled at the corners, a smile more like a mask than an expression of joy, as if she had learned too early in life that sometimes people needed to be reassured even when you yourself were breaking. Her voice was thin, carrying a bravery too heavy for her tiny chest as she said, "Don't worry, Mommy will come back soon. She just went inside." The words sliced through the quiet night, so tender, so trusting, yet something about them didn't sit right in Ethan's chest. His sharp gaze caught a small detail the child probably wished he wouldn't notice. Around her delicate wrist clung a white plastic hospital band, damp from the rain but still legible under the weak light. It was the kind of band patients wore, the kind you didn't get from simply visiting. His breath hitched, his heart pressed against his ribs as a chilling realization began to bloom inside him. Kneeling closer, his voice softened, stripped of the authority he usually carried, and for the first time in years, it held a gentleness even he didn't recognize. "Where's your mother, sweetheart?" he asked, almost whispering, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile lie she was holding onto. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head, her golden strands sticking to her damp cheek, her small fingers tightening on the steering wheel as though she were afraid that letting go would mean losing something more than just a grip on cold leather. Her knuckles turned pale with the pressure her eyes shifting away, glistening with a storm of emotions she tried so hard to hide. She bit her lower lip, silent, her chest rising and falling too quickly for someone who claimed to be waiting for a mother just inside the building. The lie clung to the air, thin and trembling, fragile enough for Ethan to see right through it, yet strong enough that she clung to it as her shield. His brows furrowed, his stomach tightening, because deep inside he could already sense the truth was darker than the child's smile pretended. The drizzle continued to fall, each drop echoing in the silence between them, each moment stretching unbearably long. Why would a 6-year-old sit alone in a car at night, wristbanded like a patient, clutching a steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world? The more he watched her, the more the walls of his carefully controlled world began to crack, his cold exterior struggling against the warmth of an ache he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to reach out, to peel away the mask she wore so bravely, but he also knew, whatever answer she was hiding, it was going to change everything. And as she stared ahead, refusing to meet his eyes, gripping tighter as though her tiny strength could hold back reality itself, Ethan's chest grew heavier, his breath slower, because the question that now thundered in his mind wasn't just where is her mother? It was why is she lying to protect herself from a truth no child should ever carry? The silence between Ethan and the trembling child was suddenly broken by the squeak of hospital doors sliding open behind him, and the echo of footsteps tapping against the wet pavement. Ethan turned slightly, his sharp eyes catching the familiar figure of Dr. Mason Carter, a man in his late 50s, whose kind but weary face often carried the burdens of truths others couldn't bear to speak aloud. The doctor slowed when he noticed Ethan standing near the car, his gaze drifting toward the tiny figure hunched behind the steering wheel. For a moment he hesitated, the kind of pause that told Ethan he already knew this encounter wasn't ordinary, that this was more than a child caught in a strange place at the wrong hour. Stepping closer, his voice lowered to a hushed, almost reverent tone, as though even the night itself deserved gentleness before it was shattered. "Her mother," the doctor began, his words heavy, reluctant, as if they carried stones in their syllables. "Anna Grace passed away just hours ago." The truth, so simple in its form, yet so devastating in its weight, landed like a blade through the quiet, slicing away the fragile veil of hope the child had been clinging to. Ethan's eyes widened, the ache in his chest tightening like a fist, but before he could respond, the doctor's voice continued with a quiet finality that left no room for doubt. "She has no one left." Ethan's breath stalled, the air thick in his lungs, but the weight of those words didn't fall on him alone. From inside the car came the faintest sound, a gasp that broke into a trembling whimper. Lila's small body stiffened, her little shoulders shaking as her mask of forced bravery finally cracked. She had heard. Her voice, fragile and trembling, escaped in a whisper that stabbed through the night. "But, Mommy promised." The words wavered, her tone trembling between hope and despair. "She promised we'd drive away to a better life." Her small hands clung tighter to the steering wheel, as though the car itself was the last thread connecting her to the dream her mother had painted for her. Tears welled in her blue eyes, spilling over as she stared forward, refusing to accept the stillness that had replaced her mother's presence. Ethan's heart twisted painfully, because he could hear in her trembling voice the echo of promises every child believes with unshakable faith, the kind of promises that shouldn't be broken, yet life had cruelly stolen from her. Lila's explanation tumbled out in broken fragments, her words punctuated by hiccuped breaths. She explained how her mother used to tell her bedtime stories about a day they'd finally leave behind the hardships, how she always said one day they'd get into a car and drive somewhere far, somewhere safe, somewhere full of sunshine and laughter. And now, clinging to that memory, Lila sat behind the wheel, not because she wanted to play pretend, but because she truly believed her mother would return, open the door, and finally take her on that journey. Her innocence was both heartbreaking and unbearable, a truth too raw for Ethan to look away from. The drizzle blurred the windshield, drops racing each other down the glass like silent tears mirroring the ones now streaming down Lila's face. Ethan stood frozen, the enormity of the moment pressing down on him. He, a man who had always measured life by profit and loss, was suddenly standing before a loss too great to calculate, too human to ignore. His chest ached with a conflict he wasn't prepared for. He could walk away, retreat back into the safety of his empire of glass towers and wealth, leave this child to a fate that society would decide for her. Or he could step in, reach across the space between them, and risk unraveling the very walls he had built around his heart. Lila's small voice cracked again, softer now, almost pleading with the night itself. "Mommy will come back. She will. She has to." And in that fragile whisper, Ethan realized this was no longer just about curiosity, it was a crossroad, a test of who he truly was beneath the title, beneath the power, beneath the walls of his success. Would he be the man who turned away, or the man who finally let his humanity guide him? The answer lingered in the rain-soaked silence, heavy, demanding, waiting for Ethan's heart to decide. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something inside him splinter, a fractin. You're tearing through the carefully built armor he had carried since childhood, and as he stood beside the rain-drenched car, his chest heaved with a weight he could no longer control. He lowered himself slowly, his knees pressing against the wet asphalt, the cold seeping into his bones but meaning nothing compared to the storm raging in his heart. His blue eyes, always sharp with authority, now shimmered with a wetness he could not hide, tears gathering until they blurred his vision, making the world around him swim as though it too was breaking with him. His gaze lingered on the tiny girl's face, the streaks of tears running across her pale cheeks, and suddenly, memories he had long buried clawed their way back to the surface. He saw himself as a boy, small and helpless, waiting night after night at a window, convinced his parents would return, that the laughter he once heard in his house would echo again, that promises whispered to him would not turn into lies. But they never came back. The lights went out, the room stayed empty, and eventually he learned that waiting was nothing more than a cruel punishment. The pain of those nights returned with brutal clarity, and Ethan's body trembled as he realized he was staring at a mirror of his own childhood. Only this time it wasn't a reflection, but a living, breathing child who was clinging to hope the way he once had. His throat tightened as he leaned closer, his voice low and trembling, carrying the rawness of a man who had spent his life running from emotion only to have it break through in a flood. "You don't have to wait anymore, Lila," he whispered, the syllables quivering as though they had been trapped inside him for decades. "I'll take you home." The words hung in the damp air, fragile but fierce, and for a moment even the drizzle seemed to quiet, as if the night itself paused to listen. Lila's wide blue eyes snapped toward him, filled with disbelief so profound it nearly shattered him again. She blinked rapidly, her lips parting but no sound coming out, as though her small heart couldn't process the idea that someone, a stranger no less, was offering her what she had just lost forever. Her hands loosened slightly from the steering wheel, her tiny fingers twitching as though they were torn between holding on to the dream her mother had painted and reaching for the hand Ethan was extending. She searched his face, studying his eyes, as though looking for cracks, for signs that this too was just another empty promise, another kindness that would disappear with the morning light. Ethan felt that gaze pierce through him deeper than any boardroom rival ever had, because this wasn't about money or power. This was about trust, about whether he could be believed by someone who had already been betrayed by life itself. His heart hammered in his chest, every beat screaming that he couldn't fail her, not now, not ever, because one more broken promise might destroy what little faith she had left. The rain slid down his cheeks like tears, mingling with the ones that had finally escaped his eyes, and his hand trembled as he reached toward her, silently begging her to believe him. The world around them blurred into insignificance. The hospital, the cars, the cold night, all of it faded as the moment stretched, delicate and uncertain, a fragile bridge between despair and hope. And in that space, the question lingered, heavy and unspoken. Could a billionaire who had lived his life behind walls of steel and glass truly mean the words he had just spoken? Or would this be another story where promises dissolved like mist in the rain, leaving a child once more alone in the dark? The answer hovered between them, a cliffhanger suspended in the trembling silence of the night. Ethan's words hung heavy in the air, echoing inside his chest like a vow he wasn't even sure he was ready to make. Yet as he felt the tiny, trembling hand of Lila Grace slip into his own, something inside him shifted in a way it hadn't in years. Guiding her carefully through the hospital's cold glass doors, he tried to steady himself, but the weight of her trust pressed down harder than any billion-dollar deal he had ever signed. Because this wasn't about wealth, contracts, or power. This was about a fragile little girl who had no one else. And as Olivia Hart, his ever-loyal assistant, rushed forward, her heels clicking sharply on the tiles, her eyes widened at the sight, for Ethan James, the man she knew as calculated, guarded, and untouchable, was holding the hand of a child as though she were the most priceless thing in the world. Her voice trembled between shock and warning as she whispered, "Sir, do you even realize what you're doing? Taking in a stranger's child could change your entire life." And Ethan paused only for a breath. His jaw tightening, his blue eyes glistening not with hesitation but with a painful kind of resolve, before he answered with quiet ferocity, "So be it. Maybe my life needs to change." And in that moment, Olivia saw something in him she had never seen before. A man breaking free from the cold walls he had built around himself. A man standing on the edge of an unknown path with no map, yet unwilling to turn back. But reality was quick to remind him of its cruel rules. Because even as Lila clutched his hand tighter, as though she were afraid he might vanish like everyone else had, the thought pressed into his mind, would the system even allow him to keep her? A billionaire with no parenting experience, no connection to her bloodline, no proof beyond a promise whispered in the rain? Lila's eyes flickered up at him, wide and uncertain, searching his face for truth. And in that fleeting gaze, Ethan saw a reflection of his own childhood loneliness. Empty bedrooms, unanswered questions, the echo of footsteps that never came back. And he knew he could not, would not walk away from her, even if it meant battling courts, laws, and the cold bureaucracy of a world that cared more about papers than people. Olivia, torn between her duty to protect him and her awe at his sudden vulnerability, lowered her voice. "Ethan, if you do this, you'll be opening every door you've tried to keep shut. Reporters, board members, lawyers, everyone will question you." But Ethan only looked at Lila, smoothing her damp hair back from her forehead, and whispered, "Let them question. I've made enough choices for money. This one's for my soul." And with that, he lifted her gently, carrying her past the sterile brightness of the lobby, his expensive suit soaked through from the rain yet uncaring, because for once, appearances meant nothing. The staff paused, staring in stunned silence as the mighty Ethan James, a man known for crushing rivals with a single sentence, walked past cradling a child as though she were his heartbeat. And though whispers followed him, though uncertainty loomed like a storm cloud above, he felt a fragile spark ignite inside. Hope, a dangerous but irresistible thing. And as Lila tucked her face into his shoulder, her small voice muffled but desperate, "You won't leave me, will you?" His chest tightened with a promise he had no idea how to keep, yet he breathed out the only answer his heart allowed. Never. And though the world outside would soon rise to challenge that vow, in that instant, for the first time in years, Ethan James wasn't a billionaire, wasn't a CEO, wasn't a man defined by success. He was simply human, holding on to the first step of kindness that might change both their lives forever. Ethan's jaw tightened as the words from the officer cut deep into his soul, his grip around Lila's trembling hand firm yet tender, as if holding her was the only proof that he was still human, still capable of something greater than profit margins and boardroom victories. And in that instant he saw not just a little girl clinging for safety, but his own reflection years ago, a boy who had begged faceless adults not to leave him in co-LD institutions that smelled of bleach and despair. And when the officer's gaze hardened with bureaucratic indifference, Ethan rose to his full height, and when the officer's gaze hardened with bureaucratic indifference, Ethan rose to his full height, his voice low yet steady as he declared that money had built his empire but it would not define his legacy, that the billions in his accounts meant nothing if he couldn't protect the fragile hope in the eyes of the child before him. And Olivia stood by the doorway watching, torn between fear of scandal and awe at the man's transformation, her phone buzzing with messages from board members already whispering rumors of madness. But Ethan didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, he crouched to meet Lila's tear-streaked face, and whispered that no paper, no law, no system could erase the bond that had already been written in the quiet moments when she trusted him enough to breathe again. And as the officer reached forward to pull Lila away, Ethan's arm shot out like steel, his voice booming with the authority that once intimidated rivals but now carried raw desperation, vowing that if the world wanted to call this reckless, then let it, for he would rather be reckless with love than safe in loneliness. And Olivia suddenly stepped forward, surprising even herself, presenting documents she had hastily prepared, proof of Ethan's guardianship request already filed, buying time, shaking the officer's certainty. And in that pause, Ethan turned to the crowd of curious staff gathering in the hall, his blue eyes unashamedly wet, as he confessed aloud that for years he had been worshipped for his power, yet utterly hollow, that true wealth was not measured in assets, but in the fragile heartbeat of a child who now trusted him to fight. And whispers rippled through the room, softening hardened expressions, until even the officer faltered at the sight of Lila burying her face in Ethan's chest, sobbing that she finally felt like she belonged. And as the papers rustled and arguments rose, Ethan lifted his chin, declaring that this was not negotiation but conviction, that if he had to drag the system through court, through the media, through every fire his billions could light, then so be it. Because for the first time he was not protecting an empire, he was protecting a life. And the room fell into heavy silence, the officer's eyes narrowing but his steps retreating, warning Ethan that battles like these rarely end clean. Yet even as the door shut behind them, Ethan knew the fight had just begun. But as he looked down at Lila clutching his suit like it was the only shield she had, he understood that this was the war he had been born to fight, not for power, not for profit, but for the redemption of his own broken soul. And in that moment the billionaire who once believed he had everything realized that only now, with a little girl's hand in his, did he finally have something worth losing. Late that night, when the battles with social services had momentarily calmed, and the storm of paperwork and accusations had been pushed aside, Ethan sat alone in his vast office, the city lights glittering through the glass walls like silent witnesses to his turmoil. And there on the leather couch, too big for her tiny frame, Lila slept soundly, her fragile chest rising and falling with the innocence of someone who had cried herself into exhaustion. Ethan leaned forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, blue eyes shimmering not from the reflections outside but from the emotions welling within. And in that silence he whispered to himself words he had never confessed even in his loneliest nights. I had everything, yet nothing, and this little girl has nothing, yet she's teaching me everything. He felt the truth of it like a knife cutting open years of emptiness, the weight of his wealth, the boardrooms, the deals, the mansions, all of it crumbling against the simplicity of a child trusting him enough to fall asleep without fear. And he saw himself mirrored in her, a boy once left waiting at windows for parents who never came, and now he was the man deciding whether he would become another shadow in someone else's story or finally stand and fight. His hand trembled as he reached out, gently tucking the blanket around her shoulders, and he could almost hear her small voice from earlier. Please don't let them take me. echoing in his heart like a vow carved into stone, one he dared not break, because to break it would be to break himself. For years he had lived behind walls of steel and glass, never letting anyone close, thinking money could shield him from pain, but tonight he discovered that love, raw, terrifying, demanding, was the only shield worth carrying. He imagined the cold officer's words, "Children like her don't belong with men like you." And fire ignited inside him. For once he would prove them wrong, not with power or influence, but with devotion, with consistency, with the stubborn courage to stand in front of the system and say, "This is my family now." He didn't know what battles tomorrow would bring, lawyers, hearings, judgmental headlines, but he knew his decision was final. Lila was not going back to a world that had abandoned her. A soft sigh escaped her lips in her sleep, and Ethan smiled through tears he didn't bother to hide, because in that fragile sound he heard a promise of tomorrow, a chance to rewrite both of their stories. He leaned back, closing his eyes, whispering to the night, "Maybe this is what I was meant for, not the billions, not the empire, but this, protecting her, learning from her." And as the clock struck midnight, the city buzzing endlessly outside, Ethan felt something settle deep within, a peace he had never known, born from the simplest truth. Family is not built by blood, but by the courage to stay. Ethan stood outside the courthouse with the weight of the world pressing on his chest, his usually unshakable composure cracking as the gavel's final strike echoed in his mind, the judge's words still fresh and almost unbelievable. Guardianship granted. For the first time in his life, he had won something that wasn't measured in numbers, but in love, and as he stepped into the sunlight with Lila's tiny hand in his, he realized the fight had transformed him in ways money never could. The once cold billionaire now trembling with tears streaming freely down his cheeks, unashamed before the watching crowd, because in that moment the only opinion that mattered was the fragile child beside him who looked up at him with hope shining through teary eyes. And when he bent down, kneeling to her level, his voice broke, raw and vulnerable as he whispered, "Lila, you're not my responsibility. You're my family." Words he never thought he'd say, but now felt truer than anything, and her little arms wrapped around his neck, holding on with a strength far greater than her years, her muffled voice against his shoulder saying, "I knew Mommy sent you to me." And those words pierced his heart, dissolving the last walls of pride, of loneliness, of emptiness he had built around himself, because in her faith lay his redemption. In her love lay his healing, and as the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions about the billionaire's shocking choice, he ignored them all, carrying her close, the sound of her heartbeat against his chest louder than any chaos outside, each step a declaration that humanity had triumphed over greed, compassion had replaced ambition, and in the reflection of the glass doors as they exited, Ethan saw not the ruthless tycoon the world had feared, but a man reborn, softened by the trust of a child who had lost everything yet chosen him, and as they walked toward the waiting car, he promised silently that no matter what storms came, no system, no prejudice, no shadow of his old self would ever take her away again, because in finding her he had found his missing piece, his mirror, his home, and as the evening sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, the city around them seemed to pause, honoring the quiet miracle that had unfolded. A cold billionaire had found warmth in a little girl's smile, and a lonely orphan had found the father she prayed for, and together they stepped into a new tomorrow hand in hand, not bound by blood, but by the kind of love that changes everything, forever.